Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of us who are in the United States. Good afternoon to everyone joining us from Romania, from Europe, and obviously from Timisoara. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Center for East Asian Studies at the West University of Timisoara. My name is George Sipos, and I am the founding director of the center. I am very happy today to welcome with us Professor Rebecca Copeland from Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Copeland is a name that needs no introduction in the field of Japanese studies. She is, of course, a path opener in the field of modern Japanese literature and modern Japanese women's writing. She is a celebrated specialist in literature, a translator, and now writer. And it is in this capacity that we will meet with her today, and she's honoring us with her presence. I would like, before we start, and I pass I pass the microphone to Rebecca. I would like to thank those of you who are joining us today, and especially the West University of Timisoara Vice Rector for Research, Professor Florin Sava, as well as the Dean of the Faculty of Letters, History and Theology, Professor Loredana Punga, and the Vice Dean, Gabriel Berdoshan. We're also honored to be joined by Professor Stanka Scholz-Chonka, a renowned expert in no theater, for this lecture. After I finish my introduction, I will put her website so you can actually look at the tremendous amount, staggering amount of academic research that Professor Copeland has done over the years, and also to make sure that you do not go to the other Rebecca Copeland website. I got very confused looking her up on the internet, and I saw RebeccaCopeland.com was a musician. I thought, wow, Rebecca is tremendously talented. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you were the musician as well. That wouldn't be a big surprise for me. But it turned out that she put a picture up there. So I said, okay, maybe not. Maybe no. You're the writer and the academic. She's the musician. So I will put your website there with the dash, Rebecca-Copeland.com. So today, however, I think that Rebecca will talk about mostly about her most recent achievement, which is a novel entitled The Kimono Tattoo, a novel that was published last year in 2021, and it has already been accoladed with the Independent Press Award in the United States. As a statement to her talent and creativity as a writer as well, not just as an expert in Japanese literature. And I think that for me, it's a tremendously fascinating topic because, when I grow up, I want to write that way. I want to write with the influence of all these Japanese writers, because I feel that they write differently than us. And I feel that there is so much power in the way they write because they don't want to solve problems. They don't want to tell us how it is. And there is more of a flow in the way the narrative in Japanese literature goes. So, I invite you to my courses of Japanese literature and to Rebecca's courses someday, perhaps if they're still in hybrid format next year, to understand better what we mean by that. And without further ado, I will then pass the mic to Rebecca. Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. My goodness. Thank you both. Thank you all for this wonderful opportunity and for these great introductions. Thanks to Vice Director Professor Sava and the Dean Punga, and to Professor George Sipos. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's just so wonderful to be here for you on this inaugural event. It's quite an honor. And given the occasion and the erudition of the audience here today, I imagine most of you are expecting a very academic presentation on a topic tied to my research. But with your understanding, I'd like to try something different. I'd like to tell you a story. And my story comes with pictures. So I'm going to try to share screen. We practiced, and hopefully I can repeat this and do so entire screen. Allow, let's see. And then I have to show my PowerPoint. Okay. Are we good? You can see.
You're good.
Okay. Yep. All right. So we will, I want to tell you a story about an academic, a professor of Japanese literature who decides to journey into a new way of writing altogether. A fan of mystery fiction, as well as a longtime devotee to Japanese culture, she decides to write a novel of detection set in Japan. Maybe her novel will entertain those keen to know more about Japan. Maybe it will reach a readership beyond that of the gifted, motivated students she normally encounters in her classrooms, or the scholars who purchase her academic books. This professor, this would-be novelist, has plenty of experience writing for academic journals and presses, but she's clueless about how to write fiction. Her journey into commercial publishing takes her down uncertain paths, and she makes several mistakes along the way, missteps occasioned by insecurity and inexperience. Her journey sometimes feels as perplexing as her fictional detective's quest, and she has to mind junctures in her own life to create the reality of her characters. But as she travels into this new adventure, she also discovers that she's not alone. Through her drafts, her attempts, her creative leaps, she's accompanied by memories of her own experiences in Japan, and more importantly, her experiences with Japanese literature. Although writing in English, she constantly encounters the voices of Japanese writers, particularly women writers, murmuring in her ear, cheering her on, giving her ideas. As you've surely guessed, this writer is me. This presentation today describes my efforts to write a novel, but it's more than that. It's my love letter to Japan and to all that I have gleaned from my experiences there and in the Japanese arts over my long career. So let me begin by introducing you to the writer of this novel. You've heard from Dr. Sipos a little bit more about my academic pedigree and experiences, but let me step outside that frame for a minute to present more of the foundational experiences that have shaped my choices and the choices that have led me to my career. When I was in my third year of college, I had the opportunity to travel to Japan. I know many of the students here today who are my age, the age I was then, are fascinated by Japan and are keen to learn more about Japanese popular culture, anime, gaming, manga, and so forth. I wasn't like that. I had no interest in Japan. I hadn't really thought about Japan. And then suddenly there I was in a small international program at Seinan Gakuin University, a small college on the southern island of Kyushu. As you can probably tell from this photograph, it was 1976, the year my life changed completely. I soon found myself fascinated by all things Japanese. I spent time studying the language, writing haiku, and reading all the English translations of works by Mishima Yukio, who had only a few years earlier died in a highly publicized suicide. But the biggest impact came from studying Nihonbuyo, or Japanese dance. I practiced with a disciple of the Hanayagi school, and my experience in dance was transformative. As a beginner in Japanese language, I was often without words. Dance allowed another means of communication, a means that exceeded verbalization. Allowing the body to talk was another way, I think, of bringing me into my eventual interest in translation proper, of transferring one mode of expression for another. Dance also introduced me to the practice of wearing and caring for kimonos. While in Fukuoka, I participated in my first stage dance recital. The day following the recital, my international program took a previously scheduled trip to attend a festival in a nearby town. And I went in kimono. I had had my hair done the day before for the recital, and I was loath to take it down, to comb it out. And so I thought I'd just keep it as long as I could like that. But it didn't look right with jeans, so I wore kimono. And I was delighted when I met my classmates at the train station to see that my Japanese instructor had also decided to travel in kimono. So this was one of the first of many subsequent experiences where I felt my identity as an outsider shift, if only momentarily, allowing me to walk into a state of belonging. Decades later, in the 21st century, when I eventually sat down to write my novel, The Kimono Tattoo, I found myself returning to these experiences, or rather I found these experiences returning to me, seeping through the past unintentionally to direct my story. So let me now turn to the novel. I'd like to introduce you to the characters and to the murder that they discover. The Kimono Tattoo is a mystery novel. The main character, Ruth
Rebecca,
Bennett.
may I interrupt you for a second, please?
Sure.
I apologize for the interruption. Do you see that you have you're sharing the thing? Not stop sharing. Can you minimize that because it's covering our text, or move it? Yeah.
Is that better?
That's
okay.
perfect.
I didn't know you could see that. So thank you.
We see it. Thank you.
That's in the way. Okay. So here you see Ruth Bennett is, she's 40 years old. She's fluent in Japanese. In spite of these strengths, she's also a failure. She failed to get tenure in her chosen field of Japanese literature, and she failed as a wife as well when her husband ran away with another woman. Financially vulnerable and emotionally broken from these experiences, Ruth returns to Kyoto, the only home she ever really knew. She is the child of missionaries and had grown up in Japan. So she feels comfortable there, and she spends her time house sitting for a family friend and translating business documents for a small translation agency. Her life is routine and frankly pretty boring, but that's the way she likes it because there's less opportunity for heartbreak in the mundane. But as the book opens, we find that Ruth has received a tantalizing offer. She can translate a novel by the long-forgotten author Tani Shotaro, or she can go on with her life grinding out translations of computer manuals. Rejecting the offer to translate the novel would be the wise thing to do because the company she works for forbids its translators from taking side jobs. But the possibility of literary discovery stirs something long suppressed in Ruth, her ambition and her need to reestablish her identity. She gives in to temptation and accepts the offer to translate the novel. But she's only a few pages into the translation when she realizes the novel is not at all what she had expected. She comes across a scene that leaves her perplexed, almost terrified. And I'd like to share the scene with you, but first a bit more background. The author of the novel that Ruth has been asked to translate, Tani Shotaro, is the scion to a centuries-old Kyoto kimono legacy, or at least he was. He rebuffs his father's plan for him to take over the family business and determines that he wants to become a writer, which his father takes issue with because it's not distinguished enough. So his father disowns Tani, and then Tani disappears. Some speculate that he commits suicide, others that he left the country. Few people, however, realize the misery that his disappearance causes his older sister, Satoko. When her brother abandons the family and its kimono business, Satoko's father forces her to marry and, worst of all, to abandon her dreams of becoming a kimono designer. In the scene that I will read, Ruth is perusing the first chapter of Tani's novel. The narrator of the chapter is a thinly veiled stand-in for Tani. Apparently, he's resurfaced in Japan and has traveled to a hot spring resort to meet his sister Satoko. The first person narrator here then is the Tani persona. So here's the scene. By the time I reached the inn, Satoko had already checked in, but she was not to be found in her room, the gardens, or the baths. When she still had not returned by 6 p.m., I decided to go look for her. When I stepped out onto the bridge spanning the Hokigawa River, I saw what looked like a woman resting along the rocky shore. Difficult to discern in the waning light, she seemed to be wearing a richly patterned kimono. I hurried down from the bridge, and as I drew closer, I realized she was not wearing a kimono. She was naked. Had her body been painted? Stumbling over the rocky ground, I crept up beside her. She didn't move. I jostled her shoulder, noticing that when I did, her skin was cold to the touch. I also noticed that the design coloring her back, legs, and arms was not paint. It was a tattoo, or tattoos. Across her left shoulder ranged a design of red maple leaves, each leaf so finely wrought you could feel them shimmer in the light of the newly risen moon. Along the other shoulder was a cluster of cherry blossoms, tissue pale, almost translucent. From the branches of both the maple and the cherry dangled tanzaku poetry slips. Each slip was so intricately painted that the woman's skin became the washi paper of the slips. Hesitating, afraid of what I'd see, I rolled the woman over. Her eyes were open, and her mouth was covered in a thick, dark blood. Satoko! So that's the end of the scene. Of course, Ruth is shocked by the scene, but what happens next is even more startling. When she turns on the television the following morning, she learns that police have discovered a woman's body alongside the Hokigawa River, the very same river that was described in the story. Ruth worries that she has evidence of a murder, and she feels that she should try to track down the author. The further she investigates, the further she tries to engage with the author, the deeper she's drawn into a dangerous plot that leads her back in time, into her own family secrets, and into the historical past of kimono design. I initially planned to write a novel about a translator, but as the novel began to take shape, I realized that the central image riveting the story was a kimono. As my work progressed, I felt as if I were unfolding a kimono, revealing layers and textures as my plot took shape. So what do kimonos and novels have in common? I'd like to try to expound upon the idea a bit more here. As you know, the process of producing a kimono is one that once required considerable appreciation of time and effort. The process involved the collecting or spinning of thread, the weaving and gathering of plants and materials for dyeing, the airing and storing. All of these activities carry with them a measure of time. Yet simultaneously, the intrinsic beauty of the kimono defies the insistence of time. Like all works of art, the kimono carries with it, implicit in the weave, the weight, the design, a sense of timelessness. And when worn, the kimono binds the wearer to a legacy of art and family and of time momentarily arrested. This image of the kimono, of the way time accrues to it, stayed with me as I wrote, pushing me to think more about the kimono and also the way writers layer their narratives. It should probably be obvious by now from this description that the trope of layering is prominent in the Kimono Tattoo. The trope was so obvious to me that when I was asked by my publisher to devise a tagline to help market the novel, I settled on this one. Silk unravels, a tattoo is forever. Layer by layer, the truth is revealed. Readers quickly recognize the metaphorical connection between the narrative style of the novel and the kimono. Whereas a kimono has a careful design plotted on the loom and marked out with dye, my novel didn't. I found myself discovering my story as I wrote. I was later to learn that writers are thought to fall into two different camps, more or less. There are writers who are called plotters, those who carefully map out their novels in advance of writing, plan their novels carefully. And then there are those who are called pantsers. And this comes from the English expression to fly by the seat of your pants. So people who fly by the seat of their pants just go out and do things with no thought, no planning, no mapping, and they favor instinct and emotion over logic. So a writer who is a pantser is somebody who doesn't plot. Whereas most writers find themselves somewhere in between these two types, I admit that I found myself more comfortable being in the pants flying camp. So let me describe briefly my writing process. In the summer of 2012, I began to write this novel. I've always been a diehard fan of mystery fiction. And I was impressed by the works of Sujata Massey and Zhou Xiaolong, who they both write in English, and they set their novels in Japan and China, respectively. I was drawn to the way they embed fascinating cultural detail in their stories, along with their mysteries. As readers chase killers alongside intrepid detectives, they also glean significant information about the countries and cultures in which these novels are set. So I decided that's what I will do. I will write a mystery set in Japan, leveraging my experiences and my knowledge of my setting. I sequestered myself in a rustic old cabin in eastern Tennessee, in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. This is a cabin that my father had built, and I had enjoyed through childhood. There, I proceeded to plan, as much as a pantser can plan. As I sat at the kitchen table, looking out over a forest of white pine trees, I watched birds take flight into the skies above the low-lying hills and found myself being transported back to Kyoto. I had lived briefly in a house in Kyoto behind the city zoo when I had been translating the novel Grotesque by Kirino Natsuo. A very dark novel with intensely unlikable characters. Grotesque explores the sordid underbelly of Japan's post-war success. I was on a timeline translating Grotesque, and I didn't have much time to do anything but sit at my desk and translate. Once in a while, I would take respite from my translation by sitting and watching the pigeons outside the window soar up above my second-story room and sail off over what was then Miyako Hotel. So this was my view. And this is where I start my novel then, with my protagonist sitting in a room behind the Kyoto Zoo, watching the flight of birds gently transform into a white parasol. Then I imagine the parasol carried by a mysterious woman in a gray kimono, walking the narrow lane to Ruth's house with Tani's novel. It was almost as if my Tennessee birds carried me through a portal in space and time and delivered me back to Kyoto, where I watched the novel unfold before my eyes. There I was again, near Nanzenji, translating Kirino's novel Grotesque and seeing play out across the screen of my imagination another translator translating another novel. As the sun would set behind the eastern Tennessee hills, I would push back from my table in the cabin, turn off my computer, and leave the eastern hills of Kyoto, or Higashiyama in Kyoto, and there take a walk in the fading light, chasing as I did the fragments of the story that were whipping through my mind. Here's where I discovered the name of my protagonist, Ruth Bennett. And here is where the dangerous plot to trick her into a fraudulent translation began to surface. And here is where my pants flying really went into overdrive. What had begun as a vague plan to write a novel on translation shifted into a story of a kimono. It's not as though the two are diametrically opposed, though. Translation implicitly creates multiple dimensions of reading and writing that unfold simultaneously. When translating, I've always been beguiled by the sedimentation of words on a page. The text is itself a layering of meaning, of words that morph into different nuances animated by the reader's perception. Many modern Japanese authors intentionally embed their text with rich elusiveness, drawing the past literary tradition into the present. This literary strategy creates a textual stratum where one work calls back to an earlier one in a referential progression that binds poetic words together. Good translations recognize the rich intertexts in the original work, and in the process of transferring those to a new language, create an additional weave of references and textual threads, often at times even unintentionally. Literary works, like the kimono, are imbued with an intrinsic beauty that defy the insistence of time. Translation, kimono, mystery fiction, in some way, they're all connected. The translator is a kind of detective trying to plumb the depths of a text, pulling back layers of meaning to grasp what is at the heart, the wick, the core, the secret meaning. And in some ways, the fiction writer is like a translator, trying to find the right words, the design, the tropes to translate her inchoate images in imagination into narrative. As I pushed forward in my novel, I began to see the way the textual dimensions in the story replicated the layering of the kimono. The more aware of this replication I became, the more I began to seek ways to enhance it. People, characters, we're all like kimono. We too are products of our time. We bear the imprint of the weave, the dyeing, the airing. My novel became textured and tiered with different narrative styles, letters, diaries, stories within stories, and multiple voices. I became conscious of the way we peel away layers and burrow in deeper and deeper in search of what might be construed as the truth or the answer. But what happens when we pull back all the fabric, the undergarments, the slips? What happens when we get to the skin? Is that where we find the answer, the truth? What if the skin is also a layer of color and code and meaning? What if the skin is tattooed? Thinking about peeling away layers led me to a scene in the 1957 story Onnagata by Mishima Yukio. So an Onnagata is the female impersonator on the kabuki stage. In this story, Onnagata, a male theater scholar watches the Onnagata Mangiku disrobe. The actor pulls off his costume layer by layer. He wipes the makeup from his face. One would expect that the Onnagata disrobing would reveal the man beneath the illusory woman. But Mishima points to something less tangible. He writes, and I'll let you read. Plug in my computer. Even after Mangiku has disrobed, it was apparent that he was still wearing several layers of splendid costumes beneath his skin. His nakedness was a passing manifestation, something which could account for his exquisite appearance on stage surely lay concealed within him. What is it that is concealed beneath the skin of our own stories? What clings to us, defining us? My novel, The Kimono Tattoo, is fiction. It seeks to uncover fictional family secrets, lost loved ones, dangerous plots, and murderers. But it also questions the real way we allow our own identities to cover us up, to disguise our intentions. These subterfuges of ours mask us, but at the same time threaten to unravel and expose. We too are layered. Most of the novel appeared to me as I wrote, as I have said, it felt as though I were watching a bolt of cloth unfurling before me. There were times when I felt I had no control over the story. And I think it may be a bit of a cliche to claim that the character takes over the writing, but in a way it was true. I lived with my character, Ruth Bennett, for years and listened as she told me her story. But Ruth wasn't the only one who spoke to me over the long and layered process of writing this novel. What surprised me as I struggled to pull the plot together was the way Japanese literary tropes and voices began to work their way into my narrative. As I have already noted, I thought I was influenced by Sujata Massey and Zhou Xiaolong, these English language writers. These I had assumed were my inspirations. I hadn't intentionally thought to emulate Kiri no Natsuo, but upon reflection, I began to suspect that her fiction had served as an important starting point. I've always been drawn to her propensity for peeling back the veneer of beauty in Japanese society to probe the dark matter below. Since I've spent so much time translating her novels into English, her presence in my imagination didn't really surprise me. The influences that snuck up on me, though, were the literary tropes and voices from more traditional Japanese culture and narrative. More precisely, I mean the works of writers Izumi Kyoka, Uno Chio, and Enchi Fumiko, a host of eerie ghost stories and no plays. Japanese dance inspired me as well. For a time, I tried to push these away. I felt they don't have any business in a modern mystery written by an American author. But they insisted, and they inspired. Inspiration means literally to breathe into. And I feel that sense of the word is appropriate to what I experienced. These various sources seeped into my imagination like vapor, inspiring my writing. In the novel, a lot of the mystery is tied to a remnant of precious fabric that dates from the 17th century. So this is not that fabric, this is a fabric, but my novel is fictional. This is just an example. In the novel, the remnant is owned by the Tani family, and it was passed down through the generations as their talisman. It's from this remnant that the Tani daughter, Satoko, derives the design for her elaborate tattoo. But what's the source of this remnant? And here I imagined another mystery. We learn that the remnant is all that is left of an exquisite kimono crafted over 2 centuries ago by an ill-fated apprentice named Shunsuke. He poured his life into dyeing the fabric, believing that it would eventually be worn by the empress. However, his dreams turn to dust when his work is sabotaged by a rival designer. Brokenhearted, Shunsuke throws himself into the river and dies. But his spirit clings to the fabric he worked so hard to create. After he dies, the fabric ends up first being refashioned into a temple altarpiece and eventually becomes the coveted talisman housed in the inner recesses of the Tani family storehouse. In imagining this remnant and the journey it had from exquisite kimono to temple banner, I was inspired by the late Terry Satsuki Milhaupt's brilliant Ph.D. dissertation, Flowers at the Crossroad. In her dissertation, which she wrote for my university, she explores the transformation of several textual remnants from the 16th century, from a garment to an altar cloth. And she shows the way that objects are rarely static. They move across time and space, and in their travel, carry with them a rich library of meaning. I joined this inspiration from Milhaupt's work with my reading of no drama, turning particularly to plays like Kureha, where the creation of textile itself becomes personified, even deified. In this play and others, the production of cloth is framed as divine and mysterious. Cloth, textiles, that which enwrap the body of the wearer or absorb the energy of its creator, are vectors into other spiritual worlds. We see this exemplified in Enchi Fumiko's 1958 novel, Masks, or Onamen. In the novel, there's a very brief scene in which a no actor from the stage observes a strange little man sitting alongside the emperor in the audience during a performance. After the performance, the actor asks about the little man, only to discover that he was a ghost. He was the spirit of the late kimono maker. He had expended so much energy in crafting the resplendent costume that he had come to see it in a performance, even if it meant traveling beyond the grave. So let me read one more excerpt from the Kimono Tattoo. I think this shows how I have borrowed this notion of the spiritual resonance of textiles. In this scene, the protagonist, Ruth, is talking to a kimono designer named Miyazaki. She wants to know why Satoko cared so much about this remnant. Did Satoko know about the story of the ill-fated apprentice? And remember that Satoko's tattooed body is the body that is discovered along the river. She had herself once been a brilliant kimono designer. And it's her last design, which creates the elaborate tattoo that's found on her corpse. So here's the scene. In the scene, the kimono designer Miyazaki explains that Satoko was convinced the spirit of the young apprentice still clung to the remnant. Miyazaki says, she needed to find a way to perform a kuyo for the remnant and release the spirit. Ruth asked him, but did she succeed? I think she probably did. She burnt the remnant? No, I think she relied on transference. Transference? Yes, she devoted herself to trying to transfer the spirit from the remnant to its simulacrum. Oh, you mean like another kind of artwork, a painting, or maybe a tattoo? You know about the tattoo. Yes. That tattoo meant everything to Satoko. It was as if with each new design, each darkening of the ink, more and more of the apprentice's spirit seeped into her skin. She began to identify with the young apprentice, his vision of beauty and thwarted ambitions. Perhaps those feelings took her to the riverbed, like the disconsolate apprentice before her. You're familiar with the no play Izutsu? In the play, a woman missing her husband pulls on his court robe and hat, and in the glimmering moonlight stares at her reflection at the bottom of the well. The moon becomes her face, and overlapped upon her own face is her husband, wrapped in his robes of old. In that momentary shimmer on the surface of the water, the lady becomes the beloved, and the beloved steps forward to comfort the woman he has left behind. There's something magical in the association of the cast-off garment, the discarded robe that once enwrapped the husband, combined with the heart of the woman who loved him dearly, are enough to summon him forward. When she puts on his robe, she becomes him. I think it might have been like that for Satoko. I understood what he was trying to say about Satoko, but I didn't believe it was a spirit that drove her into the river. End of scene. So in this scene, we see the way the spirit of an artist adheres to the substance of her art, and also the way art defies the boundaries of time. The scene derives from Enshi's use of spirits. Enshi Fumiko's spirit hovers over the edges of my novel in other ways as well. Her works, The Waiting Years and Masks, delineate not only the injustices women have been made to endure at the hands of cruel husbands, but also the clever and quiet ways that they exact revenge. In both of her novels, the aggrieved wife damages her philandering husband. However, she does so in such a brilliantly subtle way that he's hardly aware that he's been hurt. She knows, though, even if she won't admit it to anyone else, in her heart, she can celebrate her triumph over her domineering and insensitive spouse, and so can her reader. I saw Satoko as having the same kind of secret resistance. But there's another woman in the Kimono Tattoo who perpetuates a revenge. In the interest of avoiding a spoiler, though, I will not provide more detail about her. Another favorite author of mine, Uno Chio, inspired me as well. And I would be remiss not to mention my debt to her. I spent years with her work and even had the chance to meet Uno Sensei a few times. She was the author who grounded my study of Japanese literature, serving as the subject of my dissertation and my first published translations. She was kind to welcome me to her residences in the late 1980s and share her memories and anecdotes with me firsthand. From Uno Chio, I learned of the expressive power of the kimono. A modern girl, Uno Chio was also a kimono designer, her fabrics and motifs offering a new layer of stories she crafted of love and endurance. It was Uno who taught me that kimono was not a relic of the past, but a living art rich with expressiveness and energy. When I began to concoct the character of Date Yuriko in my novel, I couldn't help but visualize Unochiyo. Date is an especially lively character. She's a writer and a celebrated lover of men. And I could feel Unochiyo stepping forward in this character, her eyes twinkling playfully behind the over-thick lenses of her eyeglasses. Maemuki, Unochiyo always instructed me, march straight ahead. If Date had had a mantra, that would have been it. So in conclusion, I finally published the Kimono Tattoo. It took almost 10 years. It was published last June and took on a new life on Amazon.com. I had the chance to promote the book through conferences and various writers' events. And in part, I'm amazed that my romantic vision of Kyoto birds and mysterious women with the parasols and all of that dreamed up in an old cabin in Tennessee actually became a novel. The writing experience and the happiness and trepidation I felt when the novel actually debuted gave me a new appreciation for the authors that I've so long taught in my classes. The experience added a new layer to my encounter with Japanese literature. But it also pushed me to peel back the layers of my lifelong involvement with Japan. Like Ruth, I'm an outsider and an insider. And my curiosity always propels me into unexpected adventures. The Kimono Tattoo is not the end of my journey, but just a step along a new path. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing now. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey. and literature and theater and so many other things that that we were able to experience through you. We're very excited that we had this opportunity to hear from you. So I'll open the floor for a few questions if people would like to ask or figure out, anything about the process or about Unochiyo and the fascinating pictures. I want those pictures. So you've got great pictures of her with you and and so on and so forth about no theater and how that played out, and also the mystery. I mean, I can only admire a person who writes mystery like you. I mean, it's just fascinating. So please, I could never do that. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think I have the logical ability to actually think of mysteries and solving mysteries in that way. So questions, please. Yes, Loredana.
If I may. So you said at a certain point that a translator is a kind of a detective searching for the core meaning of whatever he or she translates, and I was wondering if you were to tell a translator of your novel what this core meaning of this novel is, what would it be? So imagine a situation in which your novel is translated in another language, right? Which I'm sure will happen. And there's this translator asking you, double checking whether he or she has got it right. So what would you say that the core meaning of your novel is?
Oh, that's such a good question. You caught me. I think you caught me because I think that an author really can't answer that, right? I think if I were to ask the authors that I translate what their real meaning is, they would just kind of laugh at me. They would tell me, I'm not sure. And what's interesting is when I have had a chance to meet the authors I translate, it's usually some time has passed since the book has come out and they've moved on. So the core meaning, the secret meaning, the wick, all of that has also changed, I think, for them. And so I'm very reader response kind of critic, I guess. So I would say the truth is what you find as a reader. It's what you find in the novel. So when I'm translating, it's tricky because I want to present really what I see as the truth, because I can't know the author's intention really. So that's such a good question. Thank you. I have to rethink that statement now.
No, there's this whole discussion about the author's role, the translator's role, who has the primary role in the whole thing, who has a secondary role. Is there a secondary role or not? But of what I understand from what you are saying, there is no secondary role of the translator, right? As long as the translator is a reader after all, right?
Yes.
So his or her first position is that of a reader and then a translator. So he or she perhaps translates what she gets out of your novel.
That's right.
Novel, after all. Okay,
thank you. I mean, there are people who would challenge that, I think, and feel that there is something sacrosanct about the author's position. But in any time that I've dealt with an author that I have worked with on translation, they defer. They defer to the translator. I mean, I have translated some things, and then the author says that's wrong. But I think they're meaning more I mistook a word, something more minimal than the bigger meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Loredana. Any other questions or comments for Rebecca, for Professor Copeland? I have a few thoughts, if I may. First of all, I'd like to say, sheesh, I can see the movie. I mean, it's right there. It would be a fascinating movie, you have to sell the rights to Hollywood. Somebody is bound to want to do this.
Do you know any screenwriters, screenplay writers? Yeah, I would love to see a movie.
But it would be a great movie. I think this would make a great movie because it would combine all this fascination with Japanese culture and, this incursions or excursions into the past and all this references that I think a talented screenwriter would be able to really capture very nicely. I mean, I can totally see it. I can totally see like back, flashbacks and yeah. Anyway, I mean, the moment I read the novel, I thought it was a fascinating exercise in layering and textual layering. I appreciated that very much, and I'm glad that you brought up in your discussion the idea of layering. One of the things that I believe as a Japan specialist, I was very fascinated about was the way you captured. And again, I'm so focused on the 1920s, 1930s, and the crisis of modernity and everything that led to Japan into the military dictatorship and fascism and all that. And I'm always constantly focused on the failure of modernity in Japan. So I constantly think about writers like Akutagawa and Dazai and a little bit earlier than Mishima. And I couldn't help but see Akutagawa and that passion of arts for art's sake in a way that is in and of itself a political statement. And then as you look at your characters, you see suddenly like Jigokuhen is right there, like the hell screen is right. And I mean, it's this phenomenal involvement with one's artistic object, to the point where it becomes that object, right? So the artist that's devoured, that's consumed from the inside by the object of their own art, is I think, in my mind at least, and again, you know, I'm not a translator. Maybe I will be. Again, I keep talking my own horn. Like, I'm not a translator of this, but this is what I would see for somebody who actually looks from the perspective of modern Japanese literature, earlier modern Japanese literature, in the novel, this attempt to sort of rework the idea of the artist and its own, or their art, in that way. But I guess you didn't have that in mind, right? Or did you? Was it part of it? I guess that's
the whole the hell screen story by Akutagawa that you referred to is something I think would make a great retelling into a more contemporary idiom. And I have thought that it would be interesting to turn that into mystery fiction, contemporary mystery fiction. I didn't have that one precisely in mind when I was writing. I mean, things just kept entering my mind, and you know, layering is one thing, but editing is another one. And I had to also learn to edit myself and try to quiet my academic voice, you know, because nobody wants to time out. Let me give you a little history lesson here. You know, this is the Kyoto, this is Heian Shrine. Let me give you the story of Heian Shrine. You know, I had to stop that. And I was able to have Ruth at one time be a tour guide. So that was one reason why she was just always mouthing off about the history of things. But it's difficult to switch hats, I guess, and stop being that educator and start trying to tell a story. So that was that's something I need to continue to work on. And in order to get the book published, I had to hire an editor who would make it shorter. It was too long. And so she cut a lot of that blah, 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 blah exposition out. And it made it a much faster read. It was much better thanks to her. So I need to work more on my craft going forward.
I think it reads extremely well. I mean, and it does have that pace that works with a mystery novel, which is essential. I assume. Yeah. I've never been in that position where I have to work with somebody who's looking at my work as a literary piece. So, you know, there's like a relief in that, because as an academic, you kind of write what you think is relevant, and people figure it out if it's actually relevant or not. I was wondering also if the name Ruth Bennett had anything to do with you know who. I mean,
no. Our colleague Marvin Marcus brought that up. He announced that this is Ruth Bennett must be Ruth Benedict, and Ruth Benedict was a famous anthropologist of Japan who wrote the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which was an ethnographic study of Japanese culture, which was made without really ever going to Japan. So it's kind of an Orientalist work. And I had not thought of Ruth Bennett as Ruth Benedict. And I don't know how that happened. You know, I guess subconsciously it seeped in, but I've never even read Chrysanthemum and the Sword. So it was so no, but it's so that goes to I tell my students, you know, we don't know an author's intention, so you can't say, oh, the author intended Ruth Benedict, because the author didn't.
but you see the temptation to think about Ruth Benedict here with especially if you think historically, the perspective of Ruth Benedict actually and her work being an influence, as historians say, in Truman's decisions not to bomb Kyoto. I mean, come on, I can write a book about that right there.
I like that. Thank you.
I mean, it's connected somehow, right?
So it must be.
For our colleagues, Ruth Benedict, her book is translated into Romanian as well as Chrysanthema și Sabia, the Chrysanthemum and the Sword. I don't remember who translated it, but it was years ago that it's been translated. So it's a famous book in the field of Japanese studies, of course. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of other questions, but I guess I don't want to monopolize this conversation. If there are other comments from colleagues, I think, yes, please.
Hey, Rebecca. So next novel, what can we expect?
Yes.
There's a plan, yeah. So Ruth will stay in Kyoto, and the next novel it will involve Nishijin Ori, so brocade, woven brocade, and I've got about 50 pages in. Of course, there will be murders, and this one will feature apprentices who come over from Europe and America to study the weaving of brocade. And after that, then I want to send Ruth to Kyushu, where I had my first experience in Japan. And I think she's going to work on the Hakata doll, a porcelain doll. And of course, there will be some deaths involved, tragically. And eventually she'll go to Tokyo. So, I mean, my hope is that I can use Ruth to help people travel through Japan and enjoy more Japanese arts and Japanese contemporary culture.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's just so fascinating. You know, honestly, when I started reading, I was like, what? Ruth Bennett? What is this Ruth Benedict? What's happening here? And then, she became very far away from that, right? She is someone very, very different who, as I said in a comment, you're combining very unique experiences to unintentionally educate the reader about how she sees things. Yeah. And her love and not love. And it's a very good balance of your experience and her world, I think. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I loved it.
Thank you.
And Doris is a potter who has an association in Japan.
Oh, wonderful. Are there any other questions for Rebecca, Professor Copeland, at this time? Yes, Loredana, please.
I'm a very curious person, so this would be is going to be a very quick question. So you're mentioning all these things connected to Japan, and I was wondering how much cultural background should the reader have? So how much should the reader know about Japan in order to resonate with your book? Is this a book for beginners in Japanese culture, or is it a book for people proficient, so to say, in Japanese culture?
So that's another really good question, and that it was hard to find my audience, because initially I wanted my audience to be beginners, and I want my book to be a way to bring people to Japan. Even if you can't travel there, you can feel you know something now about another culture, you have a taste for it, and not just the touristy things, but the back alley things. But at the same time, it couldn't be, it had to resonate with experts too. So I had to do a lot of research. I'm not an art historian, so I don't really know about weaving kimono or dyeing kimono. So I had to do a lot of research on that, and I'm still kind of afraid that I made mistakes, and a weaver is going to come out and challenge me about something. But so my goal was to attract the beginner, but I also had to not follow my face with the experts. And there's one place, in editing, I guess it happened, but somebody on Goodreads, a reviewer on Goodreads, called me out because I have Shikoku prefecture. Shikoku is not a prefecture. Shikoku is an island, and there's a lot of prefectures on Shikoku. It's one of Japanese, one of the islands of Japan. And it's in my novel. And I went to Shikoku Prefecture, and somebody just howled about that, and they marked me down a star because I made such a terrible mistake. I lost credentials, So it's a difficult tightrope act.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for being today with us. Thank you, Vice Rector Savas left, and Dean Punga. Thank you so much for all your support with everything, with the center, with the program in Japanese language and literature. Vice Dean Gabi Berdashan, who's here, and all the colleagues from Timisoara, students, and from other places as well. I'd like to acknowledge here Professor Schultz, who's joining us from Germany as well for this conversation, and renowned specialist in no theater. So I think, Rebecca, perhaps you and Professor Schultz can talk about the no pieces. And in that, we're really excited to have all of you here with us. And I will end here our first inaugural lecture of the Center for East Asian Studies at the West University of Timisoara. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Professor Copeland, for your time.
Thank you, everybody. Such a pleasure. This is such a treat for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we truly hope we'll, see you in flesh and blood in Timisoara.
I hope so.
One day.
When Dr. Sipos translates my novel, I will be there. Yeah.
It's a promise from my part. It's a promise from my part.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Goodbye. Bye-bye.